Boss rushes have been around for almost as long as video games have. For decades now, it's been used as a fun side mode that's the ultimate test of your skills, or an endgame exam that simultaneously takes you down memory lane before you face the game's final challenges. But over the past few years, there have been a fair few games that have taken one of the action genre's oldest mechanical tropes and made an entire game out of it. The boss rush as a full, independent game isn't necessarily a new idea, but it is one that's proliferating to the point where the trend is sitting on the cusp of coalescing into its own formal genre. So listen up. I'm Alex, this is First Five, and I'm here to celebrate how this time-tested side mode is getting its day in the sun. Today, I'm celebrating the boss rush. Who doesn't like a good boss? They're often the most exciting, memorable encounters in a game, where it cuts loose and everything goes up to 11. Even in the most delectable action games, bosses are often the sweetest, meatiest bites. And boss rush games take that rare delicacy and make it the main course. But what happens when you make a game that's just nothing but big friggin' bosses? Wouldn't that be just like eating filet mignon for every meal? No matter how luxurious it is, if you have it every time you sit down to eat, then it just becomes a new normal, doesn't it? How do you stay engaging? Well, I think that most of what boss rush games do to appeal to players can be grouped into three pillars. There's big scale, which is pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes a great way to make a boss engaging is just to make them big. A huge, intimidating boss that looks like it can smash you in a single hit draws attention, and boss rush games have some of the most imposing. But it's not quite as simple as that, of course. The games that are best at this don't just make a big boss and toss it into the game willy-nilly, but often take other steps to really sell just how big it is, and... Wow, that's one big boss. As another example, Shadow of the Colossus frequently uses a low-angle shot, a shot in cinema that is commonly used to make its subject look more imposing. While you have free control over the camera, when left to its own devices, it will most often revert to this low-angle shot, helping build the game's constant feeling of epic scope, even when you're just riding through a flat prairie. The second pillar is big personality, which doesn't have to be limited to a magnetic and memorable boss. Boss rush games can just as easily find an identity in a larger design choice, such as their art style. And for evidence of that, you don't have to look any further than Cuphead's adherence to the 1920s and 30s rubber hose animation style, or Furi's neon-drenched character designs by Takashi Okazaki, who also illustrated Afro Samurai. And the last big pillar is big challenge, the gameplay meat of what drives a boss rush game. Challenge will always be subjective, but boss rush games aim for that feeling of butting heads with and conquering an overwhelming opponent. The core loop of a boss rush encounter is walking into a room, getting absolutely dunked on by a boss, and questioning how the hell you're ever going to beat it.
Do I look unconquerable to you?
But you dust yourself off, get back in there, get demolished another dozen times, and slowly learn and evolve until, at last, you claw your way to a win. It's the closest you'll ever get to experiencing the whole DBZ Saiyans getting more powerful when they nearly die thing, and it is compelling. Hold on, you say. This is true for any boss fight. There's nothing here to differentiate Furi from, say, Dark Souls. What kind of a ride are you taking me on? Well, surprise, surprise, it turns out a lot of the reasons boss rush games are fun are the same reasons their primary element, bosses, are fun. The thing about boss rush games isn't necessarily what unique twists they add that other games don't have, but rather what they focus on and what they toss to the wayside. Boss rush games have a very similar appeal to Dark Souls, Monster Hunter, Devil May Cry, and God Hand alike. All of these games make big, thrilling boss fights a core part of their appeal, but they're definitely a different experience from a boss rush game. Dark Souls, and the many games like it, has a full leveling system and a variety of weapons that change your moveset. Monster Hunter World features a staggering 14 different unique weapon classes, each with their own weapon tree, as well as deep, massive crafting and equipment systems to give you a world of options in how you tackle your prey. And Devil May Cry and God Hand have these extensive move lists of like a million different ways to decimate your enemies. These games offer a veritable ocean of possibilities for personalization and player expression, and no two players are going to fight the exact same way. These games don't ask, can you beat this challenge? They ask, how do you want to beat this challenge? Contrast that with Furi, a 4-button game that gives every player the exact same equipment. You have a pistol, a sword, a dodge roll, a chargeable version of all three, and then you get a parry. That's it. Your moveset doesn't change through 90% of the game, and every player goes in with the exact same tools. Player expression is almost non-existent. Instead, all that variety and expression gets put into the bosses. You get these overwhelmingly massive opponents that take weeks to model and animate and are an entire level unto themselves. You get sprawling, 7-phase, knockdown, drag-out boss fights that can last up to 20 minutes on your first go. And most importantly, you get a wide variety of bosses that all have unique tools to try and kill you with, and introduce their own mechanics. Fights that have more in common with an MMO boss than something in Monster Hunter. In a making-of video about Furi, Emmerich Thoa, I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering that, the creative director and producer for the game, talked about how he wanted Furi to only have a 4-button layout and be easy for the player to pick up and play. He wanted to make the controls simple to execute, while the game's depth would come from the variety of challenges from the bosses they faced. And when you have a simple homogenized moveset like Furi's, you have a lot more flexibility with the kind of encounters you can make to nail that feeling of depth and variety. Instead of making sure that every fight in the game can be completed by all 8 or 10 or 20 of its playable weapons, developers only have to balance for a single loadout, which means they know exactly what you're going into a fight with. Well, with the exception of Jotun and Cuphead, which both have side upgrades you can pick up along the way, but Jotuns are almost impossible to miss, and Cupheads are entirely unnecessary, if sometimes helpful. But looking back at Furi, that one-size-fits-all 4-button moveset enables the developers to design a boss like the Song, who's an entirely ranged fighter that flies around out of range of your sword, and then they can follow her up a few bosses later with the Edge, who forces you into a claustrophobic sword fight and removes all of your usual ranged options. And they know you'll be fine. There's no ranged focused build that's going to get screwed over by the Edge, or a melee talent tree that'll be useless and leave you underpowered facing the Song. There's more room for the developers to create a wide variety of challenges between massive arenas, claustrophobic ones, close-range bosses, snipers, and those who have a balanced mix. One boss even stops time so that every bullet on the field becomes a stationary hazard you have to dance around as you fight. Every boss has a trick or two up their sleeves that radically alters the flow of their fight, but Furi's simple tools will always see you through. And it works the same way from the player's end as well. You don't have to worry if you're leveled enough or if you have enough healing potions when getting ready to face down a boss. You just need to focus on tackling the challenge ahead of you, because the tools you have to do so with will never change. The only thing that can is you. There's one other obvious benefit to this approach as well. Resources taken away from developing the player's arsenal are resources that can be turned around and put directly into the bosses. It's a more pragmatic, economical reason why boss rush games feature a simple set of tools for the player and a massive bag of tricks for the boss. In a 2006 interview with Wired a few months after Shadow of the Colossus released, Fumito Ueda, the director and lead designer on the game, an industry giant that everyone stands on the shoulders of, mentioned that they specifically took out smaller enemies because he wanted his team to focus all of their energy on the Colossi. In his own words, "We thought if there were a lot of small enemies that a lot of players would actually appreciate that, but I wanted the team's focus to be on the Colossi. If we added other elements, the team would have to put their efforts into those elements, and the quality of the boss characters would go down." And that was a design decision for Team Ico. I couldn't find any hard numbers on a budget for Shadow of the Colossus, but Team Ico was a mid-sized studio, and everyone else in this genre are all indie players that probably have even less of a budget. And 2 of them were hand-drawn no less, which is a significant cost and a restrictive design decision. When you're on that kind of budget, it's a sensible business move to cut out any extraneous fat like crafting and level systems that you might find in bigger budget titles, and instead focus on making your core element as tight and polished as possible. And in the case of something like Cuphead or Jotun, that means the bosses. It's worth exploring in Cuphead in particular. Chad Moldenhauer, who was one of the co-creators of Studio MDHR, admitted in an interview with Games Radar that they actually originally wanted to have a lot more than just bosses in it, but they just didn't have the finances to pull it off. And it's not even like this is a unique story, because you always get more ideas than you have money or time to execute. But Studio MDHR made the move to focus what they did have into some incredibly complex bosses. Even on a budget, they still managed to produce something like King Dice, who featured 9 separate fully fleshed out mini-bosses before you faced the Dice Man himself. Or, one of my favorite fights from the game, Dr. Call's robot in Junkyard Jive, where you face a boss that comes at you with 3 different simultaneous attacks. Each attack is attached to a corresponding weak point, but as you find out, destroying each weak point just makes Call's robot do something else. There are so many moving parts that designing and balancing something like that just takes a lot of time and effort. Just try and imagine how much dev time it would take if there were extra moving parts on the player's side to account for as well. So, alright, we've done a lot of theory crafting and peeking behind the scenes, but what's the actual manifested result of all that? When you cut out everything else and just make a game about really complicated bosses, how does the experience change for the player? Well, it kind of becomes a puzzle game. I know that probably sounds kind of weird, but stick with me here. So, leaning on smart internet people that have been at this for far longer than I have, if you've ever watched Mark Brown, you know that he has a lot of really smart observations on how games function. And not too long ago, he had a video about what makes a good puzzle game that I'm going to use as the baseline to explain what I'm talking about. In that video, he detailed it like this. Every good puzzle has 3 things. It has its established mechanics, and of course, all the associated knowledge you already have of how to leverage them that form your basic assumptions going into a puzzle. And then the puzzle has a catch, where you hit a point where those assumptions fail you. And, seemingly, you're stuck in an impossible situation, such as, say, an object needing to exist in 2 places at once. And finally, it has the revelation, the aha moment, when you realize something new and everything clicks into place. So let's try applying Mark's 3-step puzzle design to fights and boss rush games. You can already see it in some of the examples I already talked about. In Furi, you go through the entire game with the same set of tools, and then you run into bosses like the Song and the Edge that introduce a catch, and now you have to adapt your tactics to beat them. You have to evolve and build new strategies mid-fight to deal with each challenge's unique parameters, and in doing so, you get that revelatory feeling. And again, in Cuphead's Junkyard Jive, you run into a catch whenever you break a weak point. Every weak point you break alters the boss's behavior, complicating the fight, and you have to figure out a strategy for which weak point to break first. In Shadow of the Colossus, you start with exceptionally hairy colossi that you can climb all over with ease. But as the game goes on, bosses have progressively fewer handholds on them. It's actually the main way the game increases challenge, and the puzzle is always about finding new ways to navigate them to compensate. But the example I want to take a deep dive into is Titan Souls, the aptly named Brain Freeze, who is an early boss in the game. Titan Souls takes that puzzle combat experience to heart. It gives both you and the boss 1 hit point, but every boss is Achilles, and it's your job to find his glowing red heel. In Brain Freeze's case, the weak point is pretty obvious. That giant brain there looks pretty vulnerable. Only problem is, it's stuck in a block of ice. So how do you break it out with just a bow? Well, it won't take long to realize that there's a handy flame jet in the middle of the room, but here's the catch. In order to activate the fire, Brain Freeze himself needs to stand on one of the pressure plates around the edges of the room. You're not heavy enough to trigger it yourself, so now we have our catch. Brain Freeze needs to be on the flame to melt, but he also needs to be on the pressure plate to activate it. He can't be in both places at once, so we need to problem solve. The answer is that you need to shoot an arrow through the fire. But this conundrum isn't over yet, because Brain Freeze's attack patterns won't let you do that easily. It becomes pretty obvious that you need to bait him onto a switch, but because he's a giant block of ice, he keeps sliding around, meaning he'll move off the switch as quickly as he moved onto it. You also have to figure out how to get the boss to cooperate and line up for a shot directly through the fire. And there are a ton of ways you can go about this, but the way I handled it was like this. And boom, now the boss's weak point is exposed, and all that's left is to put an arrow in it. Now, not every boss in Titan Souls follows this pattern quite so tightly. and not every boss rush game embraces it as fully as Titan Souls or Shadow of the Colossus do. Furi doesn't adhere as strictly to the boss fight as puzzle mentality, but you could still find many little revelations in how to manipulate each boss. And Jotun feels like the constant exception to almost everything I've talked about. In fact, it's kind of funny, because Jotun is the exception to even the boss rush's core maxim, that it's a game entirely composed of nothing but one boss fight after another. You actually spend more time going through exploration and puzzle-centric levels than you do fighting bosses. And Cuphead, similarly, has its run-and-gun sections, to say nothing of the fact that developers themselves have said they wanted the game to be more than just a boss rush in the first place. By that virtue, Cuphead's almost here by accident. And yet, despite that fact, here they are. Just as often as not, these games all get lumped together instead of placed in separate genres, and that's not an accident. I think the fundamental reason why isn't because some of them are entirely composed of boss fights or because they cut out the fat to create a short but highly elevated experience, though that's certainly the prevailing opinion and what drew me to play them in the first place. What really ties them together is this collective school of thought that I've been talking about the balance of complexity between the player and a boss. The one unifying thread between all these games isn't the absence of trash mobs to cut through, because some of them indeed do have those, but rather the absence of player expression and how the developers balance that with increased depth of challenge. And I hope that this lineage of thought continues, and this nascent collection of loosely connected games blossoms into a full, formalized genre. But whether boss rush games coalesce into something more, or just remain a trend that gently goes into that good night, as all trends eventually do, they currently have this one moment in the sun. And even if that moment turns out to be a singular, fleeting one, it's something worth celebrating. Hey, once again, I'm Alex, this is First 5, and thanks for watching all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to do more of these, but my time is limited, so every little bit that gets me closer to doing this full time gets you closer to getting more regular releases like this one. If you're looking for more long-form content, I can point you in the direction of my long-winded argument as to why dollar-to-hour ratios are rapidly becoming an outdated metric. But my main meat and potatoes are my weekly reviews, where I try to find short games that respect a busy adult's gaming schedule. Check them out! And hopefully, I'll see you next week.